Microsoft. So in this presentation, this will be the agenda. So we'll be covering a brief introduction about the work and the information behind it, and then something about LSTMs and our experiments and the new approaches that we found useful. So first of all, let's introduce the topic. So recurrent deep neural networks like LSTM has been there for a long time. They're also being used for cyber defense and for making different types of security applications. And while doing so, the assumption is that all the security applications and the feature sets that they use are very similar to the sequences of words that is used in the spoken language representation using these models, and hence similar models would be used. And a lot of inspiration actually we're making the systems also comes from the results that have been produced for language models. For example, like what are the important parameters that are important for the sequence mining. But there is a lot of difference between the features that are used for cybersecurity versus spoken language sequence of words. We conducted one of the most exhaustive work in this paper around LSTM hyperparameter, which is not just exhaustive for the security domain, the most exhaustive work for hyperparameter selection across LSTM. And we found that in security applications, especially for designing of an intrusion detection system, the assumptions that the feature set or the sequences that is being used is very similar to language model doesn't hold scope, because of which a lot of different parameter selection approaches and parameter selection sequence actually changes for IDS. And based on this, we actually found out that there's also a lot of interaction effect, and to counter that, we also proposed a selection methodology. And using that, we found out the correct sequence of importance for different hyperparameters that we tested. So the most primitive RNN to be used in security was around eco-state networks, and then came the GRUs and the LSTMs. And people have used LSTMs for modeling different types of features within security. So they started from system call, APL calls, or file headers. The most recent papers which have shown good results comes from using opcodes, whether it's around Windows PE or Android. Some of the papers have pointed out that there has been a dissimilarity, or they believe there's a dissimilarity between spoken languages and opcodes, and the same couldn't be applied directly. These are the gaps that we have found in the literature. For LSTMs in general, there is a lack of exhaustive empirical studies on hyperparameter selection. This is not just in security, but in general also. So apart from number of layers, maybe nodes per layer, or maybe some optimizers, or if there is a paper which is focusing on a particular hyperparameter, mostly around those parameters well covered, but there has not been any exhaustive study so we found out that the most exhaustive study that has been done till now is taking into consideration only 50 configurations. In the case of intrusion detection system and for cybersecurity, the most exhaustive study that was done took only 15 configurations. In fact, that study was also one of our study in which we found out, and this inspiration came, that there's a lot of interaction between different levels of covariates, because of which the results vary. And in that paper, we had kept as a proposal for future research that more comprehensive study should be. And this is one of those comprehensive studies that you pointed out. But since that we spoke about, the inspiration has been mostly coming from language models. And in case of language models, mostly it's number of layers or the units per layer that are more significant. So we find that even in the papers around security, most of the papers actually revolved around these two parameters without paying much attention on making more exhaustive experiments around the features. And most of these studies do not take into account the differences between LSTM or language modeling and security. Also, we find a gap in terms of research work around finding out the relative importance of different hyperparameters for LSTMs in security applications. Now, having said so, LSTM is not used alone. There are like feature sets that you need to prepare. There are hyperparameters around those pre-processings. You have to may put some unsupervised deep learning or otherwise parameters around it. One of the most common architecture is using embeddings for dense layers, and these all things also play a very major role. There has been a lot of different hyperparameters that come into play, and without a methodological or scientific approach, it becomes very difficult to actually go about these random hyperparameter selections in a random manner. And that is what we see in many papers. There is not much of rationale given why only few parameters are chosen and not a combinations of different levels where the parameters are given. And this takes us to an important consideration that none of the papers papers that we have seen in the security domain or some of the paper outside that we have read, we didn't find many exhaustive coverage on interaction effect, whereas we found out that there's been a lot of interaction effect between different hyperparameters. And therefore, we do an exhaustive study on using interaction effects across all these parameters. And we also then find out a more effective way of selecting these hyperparameters. The figure above shows like one particular LSTM cell, which is just one node of the figure that is given below. In this, the most important thing is the cell memory, because of which it remembers things from one cell to another, or one time period state to another. And there's an input gate which adds some new things to the cell. There's an output gate which transfers the cell memory from one time into another sequence or another timestamp. And there has been also an addition of forget gate, in which some of the things could be taken out of the cell such that it could weigh the newer information more important. Below, given figure gives out the different types of interplay between things. So I mentioned about using dense layers coming from embeddings. And finally, for supervised learning, if you have to do any prediction, for example, in our case, it's a prediction with malicious or non-malicious file, you also require some other dense layers. So we'll not be just talking about LSTM, but also the other things which goes with it. So this is the diagrammatic approach of the pre-processing for the data set, and a lot of different, more practical implications of the work that should be done. So for example, LSTMs are now very sensitive towards the diversity in the sequence size across different records that we're taking. For language models, this may not be a very big problem, especially if the source of data is around consistent sources. For example, if we are seeing news articles have some consistency or some managed diversity in the number of token sequences in each news article. But once it comes to opcodes for a particular file, it may range from say 1 or 2 opcodes to maybe even billions of opcodes in files. Because of it, it becomes very difficult to apply models which works on homogeneous sequence length, because then you have to apply a lot of padding to them. And if you apply too much padding and there's a lot of diversity between the padding, the results are not good. So a lot of pre-processing has been done to get to the conformance of the LSTMs of mostly homogeneous of the size, and a lot of anomaly detection has taken place in that. So we have also followed a very methodological approach in this, and then we come to how the experiments were conducted. There are parameters which are related to the embedding size. So for them, first the embedding size was fixed, embeddings were obtained. And then everything related to the model itself, pre-compilation was fixed. Then the model was compiled using some of the hyperparameters like the optimizers and other things which are to be monitored. And then finally, the training was done. There were some parameters which relate to trainings like batch sizes. Those were also then modeled. So it is a complete sequence of things, including pre-processing stage, the model definition stage, the model compilation stage, and also then the training stage, the parameters slide. So these are the result. The first figure shows you how things work in a sequential approach. So if you do not consider the work that we have done, ideally someone would have actually done all the experiments, even if they are doing all those 150 experiments, this will be the results. And mostly then things are averaged out for specific levels of different covariates to find out to which particular level or which particular covariate was the most influential one. So the first thing that is very evident from the figure on the left is that the most important parameter is batch size. We have both batch size 512 and 1024, which are being significant in rank to 1 and 2, which is the least number of losses. From here onwards, the third parameter, if we go by this, could be unit size or number of units in LSTM, but this we believe is not the right approach to see things. And why we think so comes is stated in the figures next. So the most important parameter here would be like which particular covariate is able to drive the loss to a minimal. And across the different levels of that particular covariate, how much does the loss vary? Because if a parameter is completely insignificant, there will be no variance in the losses across different covariate levels. And the more the variance in the losses, that means the more is that covariate important across different levels across it. So if we control for the batch size, which is a top important parameter, this is the figure on the right that we get. And from the figure in the right, you can see two different things. First of all, there are two parameters, which is the dropout ratio, which has the least loss. The second is the padding size. which has almost similar but slightly more standardized loss. And if you go by the second parameter, which is like the variance or the range, then embedding also has a very wide range, although the losses are not as less, but still the range is very high. So at this point in time, it creates a lot of doubt around you, like which one should we go for? We can go by blindly go by LSTM dropout ratio because it gives us the at least one of the levels gives us the least loss. But still, to double check other things, we control for each of these three parameters and we draw these three plots. What is common in these three plots is number one, you see, if we just control for padding, dropout ratio is still important. If we just control for dropout ratio, we see padding is still important, which confirms that both of these two are actually more important than the third one because the third one is not surfaced over here. Even once the control for dropout ratio, the padding is not no more over there. But between them, although we have seen that the dropout could be more important, but to since double check or now in this particular case triple check, we again control for embedding and we still find out that the dropout still has the lowest loss. So from this, we determine dropout is the second most important, padding is the third most important, and the embedding size is the fourth most important. And this has been validated again by quickly choosing the different covariates in this order of hierarchy, which takes us to the most optimal level of performance, which is given in the 150 plus experiments that we did. So with this, we were able to shorten the number of experiments that we could conduct to reach the minimal possible losses or the best possible performance by going sequentially through the number of most important parameters in hierarchy. So we conclude that number one. So in conclusion, this paper presents the one of the most exhaustive work ever done on LSTM's hyperparameter selection, not just in security domain, but in any domain altogether. And with this, we also find out that there has been a lot of interaction effect between hyperparameters, and these shouldn't be ignored. The third important thing that we find out is a novel hyperparameter selection approach, which entails controlling for interactions while moving from one parameter to another and selecting parameters in the order of the lowest mean loss and the variance in losses. And doing so, we find out that as opposed to language modeling related papers, which always invariably comes to the conclusion that either the number of layers or the number of nodes in each layer are the important parameters, we found out that the batch size is one of the most important parameters, followed by the dropout ratio, padding length, and embedding length. These results are significant because it actually breaks a lot of different assumptions, and it breaks so by scientifically using a lot of empirical control for interactions and taking into account a lot of different hyperparameters, including the pre-learning stages and the pre-processing stages and the compilation stages as well. So with this, we conclude the paper. Thank you.